Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out. My name is Aditya Balasubramanian, and I teach history at Australian National University. I'm very privileged to be in conversation with...
Keyboard closer, I suppose, yeah? It's working.
I mean, this is the...
Yeah,
this
yeah,
working?
that's better. That's better.
Yeah.
That's better.
Okay, great. Whatever I said was not that important, but I'm privileged to be in conversation with Sagarika, Ghose and Sugata, Srinivasaraju. And this is a panel called The Art of Ink and Influence or something like that. Very thoughtful title. So, I just wanted to start with a few questions, and we can kind of bring things out to the audience and get into hopefully a more interactive session. So the question for both of you is, you both started your careers as journalists, and many biographers have been journalists, but not all journalists have the chops or the inclination to become biographers. So 2 questions. What is it about your work in journalism that prepared you for the task of writing biography? And what did it not prepare you for? What were the surprises and changes that you had to make along the way?
Hi, lovely to be here. Thank you for coming. Just to do some promotion of my books, this is my biography of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and this is my biography of Indira Gandhi. So these are the 2 biographies I've written. That's 2 prime ministers. I'm also writing one on a 3rd prime minister, but who that is, I can't tell you yet. I began in journalism way back in 1991. I guess that dates me. And I've been a journalist for over 3 decades. And when I was in television, I was a television anchor. It's a channel called CNN IBN. I was approached by Juggernaut to do a biography of Indira Gandhi. I had actually done a documentary of Indira Gandhi in 2009 for television, which was marking 25 years of her assassination. She was assassinated in 1984, and in 2009 I did the 25 years of after her assassination. The Juggernaut publisher saw that documentary and approached me to write a biography of Indira Gandhi, which I did and which has done very well. I'm very humbled to tell you it's in its 7th edition. And so I'm doing 2 more prime ministers. The question about how does journalism help you to do political biographies, one of the lessons I learned is that social and political realities are also psychological realities. You can't separate what's happening in the politics and what's happening in society from what's happening to us psychologically. These realities impinge into our lives, into our private lives. And individuals who create these changes or who create political and social changes that impinge on our private lives and our consciousness become very important. And as I began to research Indira Gandhi, there's a mound of information on her. She's been called a sluice gate from which thousands of biographies have flowed. I found a lot of information that I knew, a lot of information that I didn't know. So for me, as a political journalist, it was about going beyond the stereotypes and going beyond the headlines and trying to see differently. I think a biographer needs to see and needs to sift. Because when you have a lot of information, you need to sift that information, and you also need to be able to see. I came across the question of sympathy. Was I sympathetic? Was I an admirer? Was I a partisan of this particular person? I think there again, I had to learn to understand, if not to sympathize, to describe, if not to identify with, and to tell, to show rather than tell. Let the subject speak. As journalists, we report on situations, we go and describe a situation, and we let the subject speak. So in that sense, I think my training as a journalist helped me a great deal. My training as an investigative journalist also helped me a great deal because you have to be investigative when you explore the lives of these particular, of individuals who have such varied lives. And you come across a breadth of human experience, which you're not prepared to, you're not often prepared as a journalist, because as a journalist, you're going to a spot, you're reporting a situation, and you're coming up with a news story and you're putting it out. but to go deeper into the breadth of the human experience that the subject exemplifies, I think that was something very interesting to me. I'll just end with an anecdote and I'll pass it on to Sugata. What I discovered, for example, with both Indira Gandhi and Vajpayee was their relationship with their fathers, for example. Now, this is ordinarily not something that I would have looked at as a journalist, but as a kind of a investigative journalist trying to see a particular person and investigate a particular person and empathize with a particular person, you also have to investigate the psychology. And it struck me that both had very troubled relationships with their fathers. And that was interesting to me. And something that I had to, bring out in the book. And so I thought that I found that the skills of a fiction writer, you have to be able to also have the kind of sensibility, I think, of a fiction writer, because you have to try and describe who these people are. By fiction, I mean to be attracted to the character rather than just the political events. And lastly, I would say that the relationship with democracy, the relationship with power, the relationship with parties, which they both had, it was, again, interesting to me to discover on a deeper level. But I would say that your skills as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, as someone who's trained to see, as someone who's trained to sift, as someone who's trained to be sympathetic, works. On the other hand, you have to add to your skills as a journalist, because you need to be a little bit of a fiction, or you need to have the sensitivity of a fiction writer, perhaps a bit of a psychoanalyst. And you also need to perhaps be a bit of a political theorist and look at the manner in which your subject altered politics and altered realities, which directly impinged on the psychological lives of all of us.
Thank you, Sagarika. I think I'm on this panel for the two books that I've written for Penguin, which is my biography of Deve Gowda, which is called Furrows in the Field. And yes, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. So this is a book on Rahul Gandhi that I wrote more recently. And this is not a biography. We'll come to that a little later. But to the question that Aakash asked us, Aditya asked us, how much of my journalism helped me write these books? In fact, my experience has been completely different from that of Sagarika. I had to unlearn my journalism to write these books. Because for me, writing about a Deve Gowda or about Rahul Gandhi was not writing about their lives. But for me, it was a history project, or contemporary history project. So probably I learned a lot reading contemporary historians or historians and trying to unlearn what I had sort of come to be as a journalist, rather than, try to bring my journalism into my biography writing. So, because as a journalist, you think you know everything, right? You also approach, I completely agree with what Sagarika said. There's a certain relationship that you build with people in power when you're a journalist. And you have to completely undo that when you're trying to do a biography of the same person. For instance, Deve Gowda was around since I started writing or working for Deccan Herald in 95. But, I carried inside me all the prejudices, all the kind of, biases that people had about Deve Gowda until about 2004 or 2005, when I was very rudely awoken by a person who had served Indira Gandhi for more than 25 years, Mr. H.Y. Sharda Prasad. So in a conversation with him, he said, if Deve Gowda if Indira Gandhi knew as much constitutional law as Deve Gowda knew, she would have never clamped the emergency. So that was a point which made me very, very curious about this man. And then, even at that point, I did not decide to do a biography. It came much, much later. But I started observing this person a little differently. And when I decided to take a break from journalism, and I thought when journalism was about that hurried thing that you did to a deadline and you wanted to do a long narrative, you started looking at other things. You started reading more of history. You wanted Deve Gowda to be an excuse to write about the politics of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and try to write about the wider context in which he grew up, not just about the person. So to understand that wider context, I think I had to unlearn a lot of my journalism, give up a lot of my prejudice, and it was a fantastic thing that happened. Because at the end of my discoveries, I mean, it's called the unexplored life of H.T. Deve Gowda. Deve Gowda was, famously described in Delhi as a mumbling, humbling farmer, humble farmer by none other than Manishankaraya. But it turned out this man was one of the finest river basin experts in the world. And someone who opened my eyes to that was none other than Mr. Fali Nariman, one of the finest advocates that India has seen, a jurist that India has seen. And then when I started digging, I realized this man had done great work in Kashmir. This man had done great work in Northeast. And I went to Bangladesh. I was completely surprised. He had lost the 2019 election. And I went there to sort of talk to people after that. And they were abusing me. They said, this man gave us water. We have flourished because of him. And you put up a candidate against this guy? You guys are ungrateful and you've defeated him. I was completely surprised by the reception this man had in the corners of India and in the subcontinent, which was completely missing in Karnataka itself. He was seen as a caste leader in Karnataka. So a lot of things I had to escape before I could come to my assessment of the man. And I actually did not want to judge him. Jairam Ramesh said this very beautifully when he launched the book in Delhi. He said it's not a judgmental biography, it's a narrative biography. So the context sort of reveals much more than what I actually try to say about the man. So about Rahul Gandhi, it's not a book of biography. It's a book of political commentary. Again, trying to understand today's India through this personality called Rahul Gandhi. Why is he called a Pappu? And why is he sort of not a Pappu? Or why is he sort of reduced to, why is this reductionist thing happening? What did the BJP do to sort of completely pulverize his personality and his image and whatever? So, and I pick up larger questions around him, like religion, caste, his idea of India, his imagination of India, and write about that rather than try to write about a life which is so boring about him. He had a very boring life. He has just lived a life in Luton's Delhi, so it's very boring. It's not Deve Gowda. Deve Gowda had sort of lived a very hard life. He was the first Shudra prime minister that India had. So he had a completely difficult life. So these two personalities were completely distinct. And I used these two personalities to write about their times rather than them only.
Okay, no, thank you so much. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. For telling us about what it has taken to bring to life figures like Indira Gandhi and to put somebody like Deve Gowda in HD. I also wanted to ask you both about the kinds of sources that you use, right? Journalists are very interested in sources. Historians are very interested in sources, right? They give us insights into the lives of political leaders. What would you say the most exciting sources have been in the works that you've written? And how do you overcome challenges with respect to sources that are not available to you, but which you would like to have?
Sure, I think that I would also differ with Sugata, actually. My interest is not understanding the political, sort of pontifical, punditry on a person, because I do that for a living. I'm a columnist. I'm more interested in the person, and I'm more interested in how the person evolved over time. And I'm more interested in counterfactuals. Like, for example, for Indira Gandhi, I would ask, what if Lal Bahadur Shastri had not died in 1966? Would she have become prime minister, or would she have, left the country? What if Firoz Gandhi hadn't died in 1960? Would she have embarked on a career in politics? What if she had never repealed the emergency? Would we still be living under a one-party state? What if she had not been assassinated in 1984? Would we, would the Congress, what would be the fate of the Congress party? So I'm much more interested in mining the personal rather than getting lost in the punditry, because I think that is available in so many op-ed columns anyway. So I think that in order to find the personality, one has to look at all kinds of sources. I mean, I looked at, for example, Indira Gandhi's personal letters. I did a scores of interviews with her confidants. With Vajpayee, I did lots of interviews with his confidants, including a very golden source, which to me was N.M. Ghatate, his confidant, who literally poured his heart out to me about his life. And also the kind of poetry that Vajpayee wrote and the jottings that he made in various files. But then I would say the biggest source for me for Indira Gandhi was actually from the records of Usha Bhagat, her personal assistant, where you can find her, her menus, her notes on interior design, her sort of what she was doing on the morning that the Bangladesh war erupted. She was actually changing the bed sheet on her divan. So, these little details are very, I think to me, are very telling. And I think that what is also very telling from the sources is the kind of relationships that that they had. As I said, with Indira Gandhi, she was someone who I would describe as someone who loved what she didn't like. Indira Gandhi loved what she didn't like. She said she loved Indian democracy. She didn't like Indian democracy. She said she loved India's free press. She didn't like India's free press. She said she loved managing the house. She didn't like it. She said she hated politics. She actually loved politics, and she wanted to do more and more of politics. The letters to Dorothy Norman, for example, which I don't know, but those are there in great detail, show the kind of relationship she had with her father. And, I realized that her father, who, we always think of Indira Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru as a unit. But, of course, they were not, because the relationship was shot through with alienation and hostility and quite a lot of jealousy. Indira Gandhi actually, in many ways, resented her father. And she had this very unusual line, which she wrote to Dorothy Norman, saying, Zeus is the father god. He's the father of everyone, but he also hurls the thunderbolt. So the father is a kind of threatening figure who also hurls the thunderbolt. And then she talks about Lord Shiva, who is also the father figure, who is also someone associated with not exactly the nurturing principle. So these are very interesting vignettes that I found in her letters to Dorothy Norman. Indira Gandhi's letters to Dorothy Norman are really a treasure trove, because they actually show that she almost left India in 1963 and was going to, go to a house in London and live there. And, she was going to turn her back on India. That's why I ask, if Shastri hadn't died in 1966, what would have happened to Indira Gandhi? Would she even have joined politics? With Vajpayee, I think the interesting thing is that there's not enough, there's tons and tons of written record. But as Sugata rightly said, with political figures, you have hateography and hagiography. So you have to sift between what is a politically acceptable, admiring tome, and what are the hate tracts. So you have to sift through these things. And with Vajpayee, I found really a golden source in N.M. Ghatate, as well as his assistant Shiva Kumar, who gave me a great deal. And this was the time of the lockdown, so these two old men were very voluble, and they gave me a lot of primary information. I have to say, though, that, I wish Indian political figures would be more like Harry and Meghan. Because, how many of you here watch The Crown? Everybody watches The Crown, right? Now, what makes The Crown interesting? What makes The Crown interesting is that because we're actually seeing very personal, very intimate relationship details, right? We're seeing very real details about people. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, if you look at Mahatma Gandhi's writings in the Harijan, and if you look at his writings throughout his life, Gandhi is pouring out his heart about his own life. He's pouring out his experiments with sexuality, with celibacy, with vegetarianism. He's talking about his relationship with his son, which was a very troubled one. I wish more Indian leaders and more Indian public people would be more open about their lives. You know, why this culture of feudal secrecy and reverence, thus far and no further. We can't go any further than this. We can't know any further than this. Why is that? We should know more. Vajpayee lived all his life with the woman he loved, her husband, and her children. And he never hid this relationship, and it caused a huge fracture between him and the RSS. And in fact, I'll tell you a story. He was once asked, Vajpayee ji, when he was foreign minister, he was talking about Tibet and Pakistan in a press conference, and I found this in the TOI. Somebody asked him, Vajpayee ji, forget about Tibet and Pakistan and, relations with America. Tell us, what is your relationship with Mrs. Kaul? Mrs. Kaul was Vajpayee's girlfriend who he lived with. And he said, thought for a while and said, Kashmir jaisa mamla hai. You know, so it was a kind of a sort of something that he wasn't ashamed of. Vajpayee wasn't ashamed of it. Vajpayee he had, in his early life, a drinking problem. He was in many ways gluttonous. He was in many ways very much a ladies' man, a very intellectually tricky person, and he never tried to hide it. You know, Vajpayee never hid his life. But the biographer in India has to go thus far and no further. We can't write this. We can't. Oh, no. We can't write this. We can't write. So I just feel a little more Harry and Meghan in the lives of Indian public figures would be a very good one. For the sources, I must say there are a lot of sources that I did consult. But my primary sources for Vajpayee were interviews. My primary sources for Indira Gandhi were letters. She wrote voluminous letters to her secretary Usha Bhagat, to Dorothy Norman, to her aunt Nayantara Sehgal. She wrote letter after letter after letter, and she constantly kept writing letters. And these are a huge, real treasure trove. One line she had, she wrote to Dorothy Norman saying, when you enter my bedroom, please note I have a picture of my mother and not of my father. And Dorothy Norman writes, Indira revered Nehru. She looked up to him, but she didn't love him in quite the way she loved Kamala, which is her mother. So I found all these very, very interesting things, which to me are fascinating. Vajpayee was fascinating to me in the way that he just openly had this long relationship with someone he lived with all his life, and he left a lot of little poems to her. Which I found, again, very interesting as source material. I interviewed Vajpayee's family, and there's a very interesting interview where Mrs. Kaul tells a Hindi woman's magazine, that was also an important source for me, where she says, I'm very happy at how mature my husband is because he accepts my relationship with Vajpayee and accepts that we all live together and that we all have a common set of, that we're all living in the same house. And I asked N.M. Khatate that, what was this relationship all about? And he said, no, it was not platonic. So they were clearly, three of them were a trio. And the other thing I found interesting about Indira Gandhi was many vignettes from district magistrates, district collectors, district officers, bureaucrats, many of whom are still alive. Moni Malhotra, Salman Haider, Natwar Singh, they're all very much still alive. And Inder Malhotra, who followed her from a close distance, I actually wanted to turn some of my tapes over to Ashoka University, because I wasn't able to put it all in the book. But I think students would, gain a lot from just listening to these first-hand accounts of these bureaucrats. There was one very funny incident, I'll tell you this, and I'll turn it over to Sugata, where Indira Gandhi was traveling in North Bengal. And in those days, she used to travel in open jeep. There was no security threat. And so the chief of intelligence, Mr. J.P. Dutt, was sitting next to her, and the DM, the district magistrate, was driving the car. And she was waving out to the crowd, and the crowd was lined up all alongside. And suddenly she paused, and she said, now, Mr. Dutt, she said, telling the intelligence chief, look at the sari that young girl is wearing over there. What kind of sari do you think it is? So the intelligence official had no idea what kind of sari it is. And he said, oh, madam, it must be some silk sari. She said, it's not a silk sari, Mr. Dutt. It's a handloom from Coimbatore. What kind of intelligence do you gather? So that was the kind of vignette that I got from this district magistrate who happened to be there in these conversations. The source material is deeply enriching, and I'm so glad I got an opportunity to delve into it.
I'm sorry I'll be disappointing you. There's no sex life for Deve Gowda. And I did not probe into Rahul Gandhi's girlfriends. So that, to that extent, I apologize to all of you. But then, anyway, when I first decided to do the Deve Gowda book, in fact, the option that I had been given was Manmohan Singh or Deve Gowda. So I chose Deve Gowda. So when I went to Deve Gowda and I told him, sir, I may need to interview you for this book that I'm doing. And in case you do not want to speak to me, the book will still be done. But it'll be really good if you speak to me. So the man who was almost 90 said, I've been abused so much in my life. What more can you abuse me? Go and write whatever you want. That was the reaction of the man. But he had a fantastic memory. So I interviewed him for about 40, 50 hours over a year, over 2 years. And that was there in my kitty. But then, as a biographer who was trying to also has an eye on his history, contemporary history, you can't just replicate what he has told you, because you have to corroborate that. You have to see if what he is telling you is the truth, or if it's only his version of the truth. So I started going to various archives in India. And one of them, the very big one, was the Nehru Memorial Library and Museum and Library in Delhi. And surprisingly, he was the only prime minister without a section file. So which means there was such enormous prejudice against the man and his intellect, which of course the Congress had created. Today, they tell you how Modi has made Lallu a pappu. But in Congress in its heydays, made every regional leader look like a pappu. Maybe Lallu Yadav, Mulayam Singh Yadav, Deve Gowda, who were geniuses in their own right. Fantastic minds. But nothing was, preserved about them in these archives or libraries. So then by instinct, I just thought I should just look at the Janata Party papers, which had just been dumped there. It had not even been sorted properly in the NMML archives. So I started reading that for about 2 months, and it was a completely, it was a very, very interesting discovery for me, because I found letters that Deve Gowda had handwritten to Morarji Desai, to Chandrasekhar, to Ramakrishna Hegde, all in English, handwritten. And they were all there. They were all, dumped there after the Janata Party office, the Jantar Mantar office was shut down, and all of that was moved there, and it had not been sorted. So I found these letters, and it actually started giving me a context of the 70s politics. And then I used to go back to Deve Gowda and tell him, sir, did you do this? Did you write this? And he would exactly tell me the context and the emotion of when he wrote that. So this is discovery there. And that also sort of dispelled another kind of untruth that had been told about Deve Gowda, which is he did not know English. See, Sunil Kilnani, in his classic book called The Idea of India, the very opening line says we have a prime minister today who does not speak English or Hindi, which is completely false. Because if he had cared to walk across to the Nehru Memorial Library archives, he would have found hundreds of letters that Deve Gowda had written, handwritten letters to important national leaders, to Charan Singh and everybody else, because he couldn't write in Hindi, obviously. So something like that. And then I conducted a lot of interviews. See, it was good for me that COVID had happened. And people, I got a lot of these people like P. Chidambaram, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who had worked with Deve Gowda very closely. And Chidambaram was made the finance minister for the first time by Deve Gowda. Nobody remembers that. And the 97 dream budget was a fight between Deve Gowda and Chidambaram. And it was Deve Gowda who had prevailed. And today you attribute the dream budget, which Nani Palkiwala called the greatest budget in recent times. It was actually a lot of ideas that went in were Deve Gowda's ideas. And those ideas had a great deal of resonance in different corners of India. If you go to Punjab, today the best variety of paddy is still called Deve Gowda. And it's not a title that has been given, or it's not a government that has called a particular variety of paddy Deve Gowda, but it's the people and the farmers and the poor farmers of Punjab who have called it that because Deve Gowda immensely benefited them. His policies. So Deve Gowda was a very strong policy man. And this was something that Chidambaram and Montek and others sort of drove into me. And I'm very grateful for that. And then, Deve Gowda's ability to plan dams and Deve Gowda's ability to sort of conceive big infrastructure projects was something that I was fascinated about. And then I spoke to Sundarlal Bahuguna, where he had Deve Gowda as a prime minister goes to Sundarlal Bahuguna, who's fasting with lime juice, and he says, you break your fast, I will agree to all your conditions. Tell me which prime minister does it. He goes to him, he tells him, you break your fast, please drink this lime juice, and I will agree to all the conditions. You can set up the panel of geologists or experts that you want. I will work with them, I will convince you, and then we'll go ahead with the Tehri Dam. And that's exactly what happens. And then he brings in SP Shukla to do the Northeast survey for him. So he was a very strong policy man. People like Shukla, people like Bahuguna, and even people like Medha Patkar, whom I interviewed. Medha Patkar comes to the Prime Minister's office and she creates a hangama, she was a firebrand leader, and she abuses the Prime Minister. And the SPG is completely cut up. And then they try to sort of, usher her out. But the Prime Minister gives a standing instruction. He says, you shall not do anything to her. You shall just gracefully lead her out of the house, but not sort of book a FIR or, charge her or whatever. And Medha Patkar tells me that she had not encountered a Prime Minister like that. Because someone who had come from the movement, who had seen people's movement, understood the angst of people and the leaders who were protesting on their behalf, and he was very, very accommodative. Deve Gowda's democratic engagement was very, very deep because he fought every election in Karnataka, every election across India, right from the panchayat level to the national elections, and had a deep engagement with democracy. That's exactly what did not happen in the last 10 years before Modi came to power in 2014. So we had a technocrat as a prime minister, and there was no democratic engagement. So for 10 years, India did not see that kind of democratic engagement, which created a vacuum, and therefore you had a Modi. And a Modi comes in, and you know what happens after that. And I don't want to sort of delve into that. But as far as sources are concerned, some 80 or 90 people I interviewed, Deve Gowda's own interviews, the Parliament Library giving out fantastic information, and then the NMML, this kind of, fascinating Janata Party papers, and then, my travel around India and there's another back channel that he had established with Pakistan. He was talking to Nawaz Sharif through Nawaz Sharif's father, who was a classmate of his ENT surgeon. This was Deve Gowda. So nobody attributed anything to Deve Gowda, but this man had accomplished so much that China, as long as Jian Zemin was the president of China, he said Deve Gowda will be a state guest. That was what he had achieved as 11 months prime minister. And this is what gets into my book, and the sources are varied.
I just want to, on the point that Sugata was saying about little known sources, actually it's not known that Vajpayee has written an autobiography. Vajpayee has himself actually written his own autobiography, which is in the collection of his speeches in Parliament. And I'll tell you a short vignette of that, because it shows you how Vajpayee used a lot of humor to get his politics done. And it ties into what Sugata was saying about the way in which politicians conduct their politics. Vajpayee writes in his in this autobiography, which is not known. Actually, nobody knows that this source material actually exists, that Vajpayee has an autobiography, but he does. And in it he writes that one day I was suffering from a stomachache. And so it was the middle of the night and he was suffering from a stomachache. And this was 1991 and Vajpayee was leader of the opposition. And he was a very firebrand opposition leader. And he rings up the All India Institute of Medical Sciences and says, hello, मैं Atal Bihari Vajpayee बोल रहा हूँ. And the nurse at the other end thought this was a joke and said, Acha, you are Atal Bihari Vajpayee speaking. I am Hema Malini speaking. And banged down the phone. And then he again rings up and says, "Nahi, nahi, main Atal Bihari Vajpayee bol raha hu." And she again says, "I'm Hema Malini speaking," and bangs down the phone. And as a result of this anecdote, Vajpayee has this very interesting, that's the first Harry and Meghan moment that he has in his autobiography where he says, "I didn't realize that the name Atal Bihari Vajpayee would be met with somebody saying, I'm Hema Malini." So, it was a very, and that he was very, for the first time, struck by his fame and how much he loved that fame and how much he actually, he loved that moment. And he speaks about that moment very proudly. So I thought that was kind of endearing, but at the same time said a lot about someone who loved power and was very ambitious and wanted more and more power.